Benjamin Whitaker was born in 1968 in a quiet corner of rural Ohio, where cornfields stretched for miles and the local Baptist church stood at the heart of town life. His grandmother, a strong woman with silver curls and a Bible that had seen more pages turned than most novels, raised him in the fear and reverence of God. Every Sunday morning she'd press a small King James Bible into his little hands and say, "The Lord sees you, even when no one else does." Benjamin believed her. For a while he really did, but life has a way of crushing faith when it's still tender. By the time he was 9, the warmth of Sunday hymns had been drowned out by yelling behind closed doors. His father had lost his job at the mill and found comfort at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. His mother, once gentle and kind, began to disappear behind drawn blinds and bitter silence. Benjamin learned quickly how to stay quiet, how to make himself small, how to tiptoe past pain. He prayed at night, hard, sometimes on his knees beside the bed, just like Grandma taught him. But the beatings never stopped. The yelling only got louder. One night, after a particularly violent argument, Benjamin crawled into the closet, clutching his Bible, whispering, "God, please make it stop, please." But nothing happened. Not that night. Not the next. The silence from heaven was deafening. And so, at just 9 years old, Benjamin made a decision no child should ever feel forced to make. He stopped believing, stopped praying, stopped hoping. If God really loved me, he thought, he wouldn't just watch this happen. From that moment on, Benjamin became a quiet wanderer, a boy with no spiritual anchor, drifting farther from the faith that once gave him hope. What had begun as a tender walk with God had turned into a long, lonely silence, and a heart that no longer trusted anyone above. By the time Benjamin Whitaker turned 53, faith was little more than a memory tucked away in a dusty corner of his mind, like an old hymnal left behind in the attic. He'd built a life around practicality, fixing pipes, replacing busted water heaters, crawling under porches with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. He lived alone in a modest ranch-style house on the outskirts of town. Divorced for nearly a decade, he rarely saw his ex-wife except for birthdays or emergencies involving their 2 grown daughters. He wasn't bitter, just tired. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. It started quietly. A cough here, a little breathlessness there. Nothing out of the ordinary. Probably allergies, he mumbled to himself, brushing off concern like most men his age. Over the next few days he felt more winded, more sluggish, like a truck that wouldn't quite shift into gear. But on the evening of May 12th, 2021, something shifted. He came home late, dropped his work boots by the door, made a turkey sandwich, and turned on the Weather Channel. Thunderstorms were rolling across the Midwest. He took one bite, then another. And that's when it happened. A cough erupted from deep in his chest, and with it came a gush of bright red blood. Not the rusty tint of a scraped knee, but crimson, terrifying, and unmistakable. It splattered across his plate, his shirt, his kitchen floor. He froze, heart hammering, lungs screaming. Blood kept coming, bubbling up with every gasp. Panic set in. He fumbled for his phone, dialing his ex-wife, a registered nurse. It took 3 tries before she answered. "Ben, what do you want?" she snapped, not knowing she was about to hear his final words. "I can't breathe." Blood coated the phone screen. He collapsed to his knees. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She screamed his name, telling him not to lie down. "If you lie down, you're going to die." But it was too late. He slumped forward, head resting on the cold linoleum. In his last moment of consciousness, one quiet thought came. Not with fear, but with resignation. So this is how it ends. But what Benjamin didn't know, what no one could have known, was that death wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something far more mysterious and eternal. When Benjamin opened his eyes, everything felt wrong, foreign, sterile, and suffocating. Blurred shapes hovered above him. Lights buzzed overhead. He tried to move, but his wrists and ankles were strapped to the hospital bed. A ventilator hissed beside him, its rhythm cold and mechanical. A thick tube ran down his throat, making it impossible to speak, and monitors beeped in sharp intervals, as if reminding him that he'd somehow, impossibly survived. At first, there was no sense of time. Morning and night melted into each other like watercolor on damp paper. His body was a shell, numb, exhausted, unrecognizable. He'd lost over 60 pounds in less than 2 weeks. It hurt to breathe, to blink, to exist. But what haunted him more than the pain was the eerie presence in the room. From the moment he'd regained consciousness, he felt it. Something. Someone. Standing silently in the upper left corner of the room, just below the ceiling. He couldn't see it with his eyes, but his soul knew it was there. It didn't move, didn't speak, but it radiated warmth, calm, and unconditional love. The kind of love he hadn't felt since childhood. Maybe never. He tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was the morphine or the fog of trauma. But no matter how many times nurses bustled in or machines beeped, that presence remained, steady, patient, unmoving. It wasn't threatening. In fact, Benjamin found himself longing for it during the darkest hours of the night, when the loneliness clawed at him. He'd wake up gasping, tears burning his eyes, and instinctively look toward that spot near the ceiling. Always. It was there. Watching. Waiting. Loving. One nurse, a kind woman named Clarice, asked if he wanted the TV turned on. He shook his head weakly. How could he tell her that something sacred was already commanding his full attention? That there was a being in the room whose presence was more powerful than any program, any voice, any screen. Benjamin didn't know what it was, but deep in his weary soul he began to suspect. He wasn't alone. He had never been. And that thought, strange and fragile as it was, began to flicker like a pilot light in a long-abandoned furnace. Something ancient, buried and holy, beginning to stir. The days in the ICU blurred into one another. Sunlight came and went, but Benjamin barely noticed. Time had no weight, only pain did. His body, once sturdy from decades of crawling under houses and lifting water heaters, now lay limp and hollow, like a coat left hanging too long in the rain. He was weak, too weak to feed himself, too weak to speak. But it wasn't just his muscles that had atrophied. Something deeper had withered too. His soul felt like scorched earth, cracked, dry, and hopeless. And yet, that presence near the ceiling remained. On one especially quiet afternoon, around what he guessed was 3 o'clock, something inside him began to stir. No doctors were in the room. The machines were calm. But Benjamin felt different, heavy, not with pain, but with finality. A knowing came over him, one not taught by medicine or machines. He was going to die. There was no panic this time, just a deep, aching sadness. Not fear for himself, but for what he would leave behind. His daughters' faces flashed in his mind, the feel of their tiny hands wrapped around his finger when they were newborns. The one time he danced with his youngest in the living room when no one was watching. And then came the grief. The grief of a man who realized too late that he'd wasted years carrying silence where there should have been prayer. Tears spilled down his cheeks, uncontrollable and raw. And with every ounce of strength he had, Benjamin reached, not with his hands, but with his soul. He didn't know the right words. He didn't need them. All that poured out was truth. God, if you're real, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I didn't know how to love you back. But I remember now. Please, don't take me yet. Please. The words weren't elegant. They weren't rehearsed. But they were real. And in that moment, as the tears soaked his pillow and his body trembled from weakness, Benjamin uttered the first genuine prayer he had spoken since childhood. And though no voice responded aloud, something in the room shifted, subtle but undeniable. Something holy had heard, and heaven, it seemed, was listening. Benjamin didn't feel his soul leave his body so much as he felt himself become weightless, released. One moment, he was sobbing silently into a hospital pillow, pleading with a God he wasn't even sure would listen. The next, he was floating, high above the bed, above the machines, above the pain. He could see everything. The pale outlines of his frail body, the slow blink of the heart monitor, the nurses walking briskly down the corridor just outside the door. Yet he felt no attachment to the scene below. It was like looking at an old photograph. Familiar, but no longer his. He hovered just beneath the ceiling, and then something shifted. Without warning, Benjamin was pulled, gently but with purpose, into a light so brilliant it should have blinded him. But it didn't. It embraced him, surrounded him, became him. The sensation was indescribable. Words like love and peace fell short, as if the English language had no vocabulary to capture the beauty of it. The light wasn't just around him. It was in him, flowing through every fiber of his being like warm honey on a winter morning. He wasn't alone. He was home. That was the only word that made sense. Home. Not the one with peeling paint and old furniture back in Ohio, but the one his soul had always remembered without knowing. The trees shimmered with color more vivid than anything he'd seen on Earth. Each blade of grass moved as if dancing to a melody only the soul could hear. Even the air sang, carrying what felt like a chorus of welcome. And then he understood, without being told, without speaking a word, that he was fully known. Every memory, every failure, every broken prayer, every bitter thought, all of it laid bare. And yet, he was still loved. Not in spite of those things, but somehow, through them, Benjamin had not just found light. He had become part of it. The pain of life melted away. The scars, physical and emotional, held no weight here. In that sacred space, he wasn't the forgotten child hiding in the closet, or the divorced man who'd given up on hope. He was simply Benjamin, the son, not of a religion, not of a church, but of the Father. And for the first time in over 40 years, he remembered who he truly was. As Benjamin stood, though he had no legs to stand on, in that radiant realm of light and love, another presence began to draw near. This one was different, not lesser, not greater, but distinct. The air itself seemed to hush, as if creation were holding its breath. And though there were no introductions, no name tags, Benjamin knew. He knew. It was him, Yeshua. The same Jesus his grandmother used to sing about on Sunday mornings in that little Baptist church back in Ohio. The same Jesus whose name he'd whispered in confusion as a child, then cursed in silence as a broken man. And yet, here he was, not seated on a golden throne, not dressed in flowing robes of judgment, but radiating a love so personal, so intimate. Benjamin felt it wrap around his very essence. Yeshua didn't speak in words, not the way people do. He spoke in knowing, a kind of deep, soul-level communication that bypassed vocabulary altogether. And in that exchange, Benjamin understood more in a moment than he could have in a lifetime of sermons. There was no list of wrongs, no replay reel of sins, no wagging finger or condemnation, just a presence that saw everything and still chose to love. Benjamin wanted to fall to his knees, to weep, to apologize. But before the thought could fully form, Yeshua's spirit whispered through him, I never left you. Even when you walked away, I walked beside you. That broke him, in the best possible way. It shattered the bitterness he'd carried since childhood, melted the resentment he'd clung to like armor. Every accusation he'd hurled at God in his darkest hours, every "where were you?" was answered in a single, sacred truth. He had always been there. There were no sermons in that moment, no altar calls, just reunion, restoration, redemption. And then, Benjamin felt two warm, firm hands press gently against his chest, not with force but with direction. A nudge, a return. He didn't want to go. Not now. Not when he had finally remembered what love felt like. But the touch wasn't harsh. It was tender. "Your time is not finished," the light seemed to say. And just like that, the embrace of heaven began to fade. The colors dimmed. The air grew heavier. Benjamin was going back. But he would never again be the man who had left. The return was not abrupt. It felt more like being gently carried downstream, away from light and music and memory, back into something heavier, something small. Benjamin felt the warmth of those hands pressing into his chest, and suddenly, the brilliance of heaven began to fade. The colors dimmed. The sweetness in the air was replaced by the scent of disinfectant and plastic tubing. The stillness gave way to the frenzied chorus of machines, alarms, and human voices. "Benjamin, stay with us," someone shouted. He opened his eyes, just barely, and the first thing he saw was the same ceiling he'd once floated above. But something was different now. The presence was gone. The spot near the corner of the room that had once radiated warmth now felt empty, like a candle extinguished in the dark. He was back. Back in the broken shell he had tried to leave behind. The doctors and nurses swarmed around him, adjusting monitors, checking his vitals, speaking in urgent tones. But Benjamin heard none of it. All he could think about was where he had just been. The light. The love. Yeshua. And the words still echoing in his soul. "Your time is not finished." At first he couldn't make sense of it. Why would heaven send him back to this fragile, aching body? To a world full of confusion, pain, and noise? Why him? Why not someone more faithful, more educated, more worthy? He had spent most of his life running from God. Shouldn't someone else have been chosen? But as he lay there staring at the pale walls of his ICU room, another voice, not audible but deep and sure, rose up within him. "Why not you? You are my son." It struck him like a thunderclap, not with fear but with truth. Everything changed in that moment. The bitterness melted, the doubt unraveled. He didn't need a pulpit or a collar. He didn't need a perfect past. All he needed was willingness. Benjamin had not been sent back to survive. He had been sent back to speak. And this time, he would not remain silent. Benjamin Whitaker's near-death experience offers something more than just a dramatic story. It offers a mirror, especially for those of us who've lived long enough to carry both the weight of regrets and the ache of unanswered questions. His life paints a picture many can relate to. A childhood once touched by faith, only to be buried beneath years of silence, disappointment, and loss. Like Benjamin, some of us stopped praying years ago, not because we didn't believe, but because we didn't know how to keep believing in the face of real pain. And yet, what his story reveals is perhaps the most profound truth of all. God never stops waiting. Even after 4 decades of bitterness and distance, one whispered. Tearful prayer was enough to reopen the line between Benjamin and the father he'd long forgotten. Not only was God still listening, he had never left. That's a powerful reminder for anyone who has ever wondered if it's too late to come back, too far gone to be forgiven, or too broken to be used. Benjamin's story shows us that the door of grace doesn't close quietly behind us. It stays cracked open, even when we've convinced ourselves we no longer deserve to walk through it. And perhaps even more comforting is the way God met Benjamin, not with judgment, not with shame, but with love. Pure, overwhelming, unconditional love. Yeshua didn't replay his sins or shame him for the years lost. Instead, he embraced him, reminded him who he was, and gently sent him back with a mission. For many older adults, it's easy to believe our best years are behind us, or that our time to make an impact has passed. But Benjamin's story reminds us that if we're still breathing, we're still being called. The lesson is clear. It's never too late to return, and no life is too ordinary to carry extraordinary purpose. Whether we've lived a life of strong faith or wandered far from it, the Father's love remains the same. The spiritual journey doesn't retire with age. It deepens. We may have fewer years ahead than behind, but the years we do have can still echo into eternity if we're willing to say yes. Benjamin's message is ultimately an invitation, quiet, gentle, but urgent. Come home. Remember who you are. You are still loved. And your story is not over yet.